Welcome to the AP Environmental Science lecture on biofuels. We're only looking at one learning objective, and we're really only looking at one part of one learning objective for this, but I'm going to expand this out into more than just ethanol. Here's the vocab, and as usual, I'm going to skip it. And we'll just get right into it. So biofuels are any fuel that are refined from biomass. Now we're not talking about primary biomass here. Primary biomass would be like if you were just burning wood to heat a home or to generate electricity, if you're burning crop residues, etc. What we're doing with biofuels is refining either wood or crop residue or corn or anything along those lines. And we're making one of these three types of fuels: biodiesel, bioethanol, or biogas. And then all of those are going to be combusted and used as a substitute for traditional fossil fuels. So the first one that we'll talk about is biodiesel. This is used as a diesel substitute, so you're using this in a diesel engine. This biodiesel is going to be chemically refined from fatty acids. Usually you're going to be using it used cooking oil. So people will make this at home. They'll go to fast food restaurants where they have lots and lots of cooking oil from the frying vats, and they'll take it home and they'll refine this so they can put it into so they can make their own biodiesel and use it in their own vehicles. You can use other sources. There are some fatty species of algae that are being in research and developmental stages and hopefully for industry. But you guys don't need to know all of this process. I just put it here in case you're interested and to fill up space on the diagram. But what we're doing is taking used cooking oil or other sources of lipids and refining them down into biodiesel. Okay. All right, so the second one that we're going to talk about is bioethanol. This is the one that the learning objective focuses on, so we're going to talk about it a little bit more. The product is ethanol. This is an alcohol. This is the same alcohol that is found in the alcohol that people drink. So this would be beer, wine, whiskey, any of that. It is C2H5OH. We just call it bioethanol to distinguish it from as a fuel from the ethanol that would be in wine or beer or whiskey or vodka or whatever. What we're typically going to be using to as a source for the sugars is corn. However, it could be any sugar-rich plant matter. It could be sugar cane. It could be sugar beets. Anything will ferment down and distill down into bioethanol. Okay. This corn problem, or the fact that we have to have any type of plant matter to refine down into this product, is going to contribute to land use. So you'll see a lot of land in the United States being planted for corn simply to ferment down into bioethanol rather than to be consumed by humans or be consumed by animals that will be consumed by humans. So it does come with a large land use impact, which we'll talk about later on. We can use this as a gasoline substitute or a gasoline additive. You see that there's lots of carbons and hydrogens that we can use for combustion, and you probably know that alcohol burns really well. So think of like a Molotov cocktail. Alcohol burns really well if it's a higher grade or pure alcohol. A lot of the time we're going to be using either E15 or lower. So when you go to the pump, you might see E15. What that means is that it is 85% gasoline and 15% ethanol, or thereabouts. Sometimes it'll be like a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more, but typically it's like just a little bit less than 15%. You might be buying E12 or E10 or E5 or pure gasoline. Some cars, if they're flex fuel, if they're rated for this, so do not put E85 fuel in your car if it's not rated for it. But some vehicles can use E85 fuel, which means that's 85% ethanol and 15% gasoline. And again, do not put this in your vehicle unless you know that your vehicle can use it. Read the owner's manual. Otherwise, you can totally ruin your engine. Some engines are going to require pure gasoline, so it's not applicable for all engines. So like a 2-cycle engine that you would use for a chainsaw, for example, you cannot use bioethanol. So essentially what we do is the same type of thing that you would use to produce whiskey. Essentially, you just take corn, you grind it, you cook it, you mash it, you create your corn mash, which is then fermented, and then you distill it, and then you get that ethanol out. Now they're getting a more refined ethanol product out of this. They're trying to get 100% pure ethanol rather than what you would do for whiskey, and you're not going to age it or anything, but it's basically the exact same process. You create a corn mash, you ferment that mash, then you distill it after it is fermented. The fermentation product of the yeast is the ethanol, so that's the yeast waste product. You might have done a lab like that in biology class. So those yeasts are just producing lots of ethanol. You distill it. You get other distillates off of that. So you'll get some methanol, you'll get some butane, etc. off of that. You can use those as chemical solvents, but the ethanol is what you want as the fuel. Okay. And then we have biogas. I'm going to talk about this one for a little bit also because we're going to see this come up again and again when we talk about waste, the waste stream. So sometimes you'll see this referred to as syngas, but usually you'll see it as biogas. It is just methane, okay? So all that we're talking about here is methane. And we all know that methane burns really, really well and that it comes from a lot of sources, especially enteric fermentation or anaerobic respiration, like in this fermenter. So there's a lot of ways that you can create biogas. For example, you can get biogas directly from animal waste. You put all of that into like this fermenter, and then you allow it to decompose under anaerobic conditions when you get, and then you'll get your biogas. You can use that biogas in an engine to turn a generator to create electricity. It is totally carbon neutral, as are all the other ones. We'll talk about that in a second. But that's just one way that you can get biogas. You could not use animal manure at all. You could use organic waste and have this go into a composting facility where it goes into this fermenter. But we'll talk about some other ways that we can get it from like landfills and stuff like that later on in the school year. Okay, so biofuels are one of our renewable energy resources. Now, again, ethanol can come with a huge land use demand, but some of the other ones are a little bit more sustainable. So if we're talking about getting used cooking oil and turning it into biodiesel, it really depends on the supply of used cooking oil, but there's plenty of it and lots of it goes into landfills. So that's a more sustainable approach than growing large fields of corn to refine down into bioethanol. But it is definitely renewable if it's managed properly. They can replace these liquid and gaseous fuels for many of their uses, and if automobile manufacturers were to create more vehicles that have more flex fuel vehicles that can use bioethanol, then we could reduce the demand for fossil fuels, specifically gasoline. If more people or if industry was to create biodiesel, then we can replace some of the diesel demand. And again, that is a petroleum product, so fossil fuel. There is a lot of problems though. A lot of engines, like I've said, are not compatible with bioethanol. Biodiesel and bioethanol have been shown to be less powerful than traditional diesel or gasoline. They don't release as much energy. You'll never see people drag racing on biodiesel or bioethanol because it just doesn't produce as much energy per liter or per gram as high octane fuel, for example. The big thing though, this is a huge positive, it is carbon neutral. Carbon neutral essentially means that it is operating in the short-term carbon cycle. We're talking about maybe a year, 2 years or so. So imagine that we have a corn plant. Imagine that we have a corn that is growing from seed to harvest in one growing season. It's planted in May, it's harvested in September. Okay? That corn is going to take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and is going to do photosynthesis, and it's going to bring that carbon dioxide into its cells where it's going to do the process of photosynthesis in the chloroplast and all that stuff that you learned in biology, and it's going to convert carbon dioxide, water into organic matter, into sugars. That biomass can be refined into a biofuel, and then that biofuel is combusted. Let's say that that corn was harvested in September. It takes a while to ferment it and distill it. So let's say that it ends up in a vehicle as a biofuel in January the next year, maybe December of the same year. And then it's combusted and that CO2 is returned back to the atmosphere. The same amount of CO2 that came down from the atmosphere and was incorporated into biomass is sent back into the atmosphere through all of the processes of fermentation and combustion. There is some added carbon emissions in the entire process. So if you're harvesting that corn, you need a combine. If you are transporting that corn anywhere, you need to use fossil fuels potentially to transport them. You could be transporting on biodiesel. In order to get the heat to create the corn mash, you need to have a heat source. In order to have a heat source to distill, you may be burning fossil fuels, etc. You might be burning syngas. So it really just depends on what the other fuel sources are in the supply chain that makes it more or less carbon neutral. But if we're just focusing on the corn plant being refined into a biofuel and then being combusted, that carbon dioxide that was in the atmosphere that year is being returned to the atmosphere that year or the next year or the next year, right? In a very short-term carbon scale. So that is carbon neutral. We can contrast that with our fossil fuels, where those carbon atoms have been out of atmospheric circulation. They've been locked in the geology of the Earth for millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years. Okay. So a little bit more about the environmental impact of biofuels. It can emit some greenhouse gases, right? The CO2 from combustion is a greenhouse gas, but again, that is carbon neutral. The methane that could be coming from leaks from, let's say, like one of the power plants that you saw on the previous slide, that methane is carbon neutral. However, methane is a stronger greenhouse gas than CO2 is. So, just tightening up infrastructure. It is carbon neutral though, so still carbon neutral. We do have this land use impact. So again, corn and soy are usually used to convert into biomass. Some other options could be crops like elephant grass, which you see up here in the top right. It's a perennial crop. You don't disturb the soil. You don't till the soil or replant anything. It's perennial. It comes back every year, and it grows really, really fast and refines down into a really good bioethanol. Algae is another really cool alternative, which people are experimenting with. So we could limit the land use impact as well. So a little bit about economics. This isn't an economics class, but we do need to know the relative use of these fuels. Biofuels do represent a growing share of the market, but as you can see from this graph on the right, it does appear to be plateauing out throughout the mid 2010s. So bioethanol especially grew in the early to mid 2000s and then has been plateauing through the 2010s. For this graph, we're not going to distinguish between biodiesel and renewable diesel in this class, so don't really worry about it. You don't see syngas on this graph. And I do want to point out that even though it is a growing market, and even though we're using over 15 billion gallons of biofuels, this is probably per year. It has to be per year. It only represents about 7.3% of all of the fuel that we use per day in the United States. Okay. It is growing globally, not widely used and definitely sporadic around the world, but is expected to grow even more as we phase off of fossil fuels in the near future. So for the human health effects, there's little to none when comparing to fossil fuels. If we skip down to this bottom one, it does burn much cleaner than traditional fossil fuels. So bioethanol will produce very few nitrous oxides, no sulfur dioxide, hardly any particulate matter. Biodiesel will produce much, much, much less sulfur dioxide than traditional diesel does, because diesel is one of our main sources of sulfur dioxide in transportation, whereas biodiesel burns much, much, much cleaner. It doesn't have those sulfur impurities that the fossil fuel diesel does. These are non-toxic if ingested. However, alcohol is a poison. So if you were to drink 200 proof moonshine, you would get alcohol poisoning, the same as if you drink pure bioethanol, you would get alcohol poisoning. But you can look up videos of people drinking biodiesel just to prove the point that it is non-toxic. I would not recommend that you do it, but well, I would not recommend that you drink it, but you can look up the videos. I don't care. And you don't really have to worry about this one, but I just wanted to mention it, so it's on the slide. All right, that's it for biofuels. You can read the learning objective, but we hit every point and much, much more. So if you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see you all in class. Bye.